Welcome. In this video, I will discuss how you can use mountains in your landscape. So essentially, mountain is a very main element of many landscapes, and the way essentially mountain is used is mostly as a backdrop. Essentially, so there are the two main ways in which you can use a mountain. One, they are always at the back, in a sense, that they are always at a distance, because that's just the nature of the mountains. But what you can do is essentially use them in two ways. One is to have them as a backdrop, but then you can also have some other elements in the front. So you can have some kind of foreground element. So here what I will do is to simply I'll just draw two tree trunks, and you can again have again a receding a landscape, right? So that can be receding into the distance. And then what you can do is to use a mountain as a kind of resting place for the eyes. So now, as I've discussed before, anytime you have a kind of landscape that is receding into the distance, it's always good to have some element where the eyes can rest of the viewer. And usually we have seen using a distant parallel line or a kind of distant foliage. And here a mountain is a great element to add where the eyes can rest in a distant horizon. So here this is where you can add the mountains. And what you can do over here is to again have something else in front. So normally in a landscape like this, you will create a kind of a distant tree line. So the other thing to always do is to have some kind of other element at the base of the mountain. So there's a transition from the mountain, from the ground to the mountain. So that's what I do. So usually I draw an element like a distant tree line in the horizon, in the distant horizon. And then here we have this kind of tree trunks receding, or you can have trees or any other elements receding. And then what you can do is to draw a mountain above this distant tree line, right? So you have this distant tree line, and then here I can go ahead and add my mountain over here, something like this. So this is one way in which you can add a mountain. And in this case, what the mountain is doing is to act as a kind of backdrop, the ultimate backdrop in a way, right? So this is the ultimate backdrop. And what happens is that the viewer's eyes, they travel the distance, they go from here and they take in all the the foreground elements, right? So if you have some you can even put a rock on the ground, for example, over here, something like this. So the viewer's eyes will take all this foreground element, and then they will ultimately look at this distant tree line and ultimately rest at this distant mountain. So this is one way in which the distant mountains can act as the ultimate backdrop. And there are many different ways in which we can texture the mountain. So essentially when we talk of mountain, the thing to keep in mind is that there is no one defined shape for a mountain, or even the defined surface texture. So there are infinite varieties in which mountains come, and there are many different ways in which you can draw them and texture them. So one of the way that I've shown is to essentially use these parallel lines to create a kind of surface planes. So what we do in this technique is to essentially use these parallel lines to give a basic tone to the mountain. And then what we do is we come back and add a bit more of these parallel lines to essentially define these kind of rugged planes on the surface of the mountain. And an example of this is over here. So this is a demonstration which exactly shows what I was just discussing, which is that we have a foreground tree trunks, and then we have a kind of distant tree line, and then we have the mountain where our eyes ultimately rest. And the way I drew this mountain is to essentially use these parallel lines to texture the surface. And then I also added a bit more of these parallel lines to create the tonal difference that creates these planes on the surface of the mountain and gives an impression of some kind of jaggedness. So that's a very simple technique, and this is a very effective technique. So this is a technique that you can use to essentially create a mountain as a backdrop to any of your landscape that are receding. And it's a very effective technique, and it really creates a nice pleasing place where the viewers can rest their eyes as they travel the landscape. So this is the one way in which the mountains can act as a kind of backdrop in a landscape. The other technique, or the other way, is to essentially use the mountains as the main element themselves. So what you can do essentially is to essentially just focus on the mountains itself. So over here what I can do is I can just simply start by drawing my mountain over here, and then simply create a kind of a distant tree line. But I will not really add any other elements in the front to take the attention away from the mountain. So in this case what I'm doing is to essentially just let the viewers they go directly to the mountain. So I will not really put any other element over here. So the whole thing is in your composition, you always have to kind of in a way decide how you want the viewers to travel your landscape. So if you have some other elements in the foreground, like here I have these tree trunks, right? So in this case the tree trunks they become the primary focal point. So it's again going back to this landscape over here. So over here the trunks are our primary focal points, and what happens is that viewers they always travel from this point up. So viewers eyes, they always enter from from bottom and then they travel like this, so in this case, they will enter from here, and then these trunks, or if you have trees or any other element in the foreground, even these flowers, they became a primary focal point. So these are seen first, and then they continue to travel, and then ultimately their eyes rest at the mountain. So this is the one landscape that we discussed. But the other approach of using mountain is to essentially leave out your foreground element. In this case, your mountains, they themselves become the primary focal point, and you don't really add anything else in the front to take that attention away. So in this case, when we are using mountains in this scenario, then what we want is to give our mountains a bit more feel. So in a sense, what we want to show is a bit more detail on the mountain. So essentially, when your mountains are out back in the distance, like in this composition, then we don't really want to show more details, because the key point to remember is that the amount of detail that you show on an element is always dependent on how close that element is to the viewer. So if our mountains are closer, and we are kind of bit of focusing explicitly on them, then I think we want to show more detail, because that's what the viewers his attention is focused on. So in this case, I've shown two different techniques for drawing the mountain. So one technique is over here, where we actually draw much more explicit planes on the surface of the mountains. So in this video, in this demonstration, I've shown how you can draw these planes and bring out much more jagged nature of the mountain. And as you can see here, I define a bit more interesting plane as well, right? So you can always have the plane a bit more interesting. So for example, here I have a kind of distant line, but yeah, if you want, we have seen how you can easily draw these kind of receding planes, and then you can have your mountain something like this, or done over here, something like this, right? So so this is what you can do in terms of creating a kind of nice interesting floor for the mountain. So this is what we did over here, but also we created a much more interesting shape for the mountain. So this is a different technique where you actually create this kind of jagged edges, and you also create this kind of marks and indentations on the surface of the mountain. So this is different techniques. So as you can see, this mountain and this other mountain, they have a very different feel. So like I said before, there are many different techniques of showing a mountain, and over here we are focusing more on a kind of a feel for the surface jaggedness of the mountain, and but here we are actually bringing out much more the explicit edges of the mountain. So these are different techniques, and yeah, this technique is much more appropriate, for example, when you are showing a mountain in its own. So this is so in this composition, when the viewers that travel over here, so they will quickly move on to the mountain, and this will become their main focal point. So this is why it's good to use a mountain with much more interesting planes, like we have done over here, when the mountain is the main element of your focus. So that's one technique of drawing the mountain, and in this composition again, the mountain is the main focus itself. And what I also showed was another technique of drawing the mountain over here. So over here in this composition again, I'm not really kind of adding anything to the foreground. So over here again, we simply have indication of for some kind of ground cover, and then again, I use a distant tree line as a main element to provide the transition from the ground to the mountain. And over here what I did was to also create a nice kind of layered feel for the mountain. So essentially, again, when you think of mountain, you can think of them as, in this case, where you just have one row, and then, you have this kind of surface planes. Or this is another technique, where you can actually, nicely create these layers of mountains. So it gives it much more depth, and also it adds interest to the mountain. So essentially what you want to do is to essentially, when the mountains are the main element, or like over here, you want to, create more interest. So the two ways in which you can create interest is to, create mountains with this kind of, planes. So that creates more depth, and you can see, the viewers, then they can travel a bit more, with the mountain out into the distance, right? So it creates a bit more depth to the mountain. Or you can then also create the mountains with these kind of jagged planes, that adds much more interest to them. So these are the two techniques that you can use to create the mountains when they are the main element of the focus, and you're not adding any other foreground element to take that interest away from them. So this is what I've showed in my demonstrations, to essentially how you can draw mountains in this way and in this manner, and then you can use these techniques to essentially just create the mountain and just simply add a kind of some element at the ground, like a distant tree line or a foliage or something like that. But yeah, and essentially if you don't add any kind of foreground element, then they become the main focus of attention. Or the alternate approach is to essentially use the mountain as a kind of backdrop where the viewers their eyes can rest. So over here, as you can see in this composition, I simply have my mountain in the backdrop. So this is one such composition. So again, so these are two main ways in which you can mountain. Yeah, but the key thing is that there are many different ways in which the mountains can be drawn. And in my mountain playlist, you can see a lot of different techniques that I've used to draw mountains in different demonstrations. And yeah, try to watch these demonstrations, learn those different techniques, and yeah, use them for drawing the mountains, either as the backdrop or as main attention in the main focus themselves of the composition. Thanks, take care, have fun, bye bye.